Thank you. Urgent question, Mr. Chris Bryant.
Mr. Speaker, will the Leader of the House make a statement on the government consultation on short money?
Minister John Penrose.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to confirm that since we last discussed this topic on the day the House rose for recess, we have completed the steps I promised at the time. On Friday, the 12th of February, I tabled the statutory instrument required to change the allocations of policy development grants to fund political parties in line with the recommended changes put forward by the Independent Electoral Commission. And last Thursday, the Deputy Leader of the House and I tabled a request for views about potential similar changes to short money. I hope the House will therefore appreciate why I am responding to this UQ. The parallels between policy development grants and short money, both forms of taxpayer funding for political parties, are strong. And since short money is larger and more valuable than policy development grants, it seemed sensible to take a similar approach. The request for views asks some important questions. For example, the cost of short money has gone up by 50% since 2010, and by a whopping 68% by the end of this Parliament if nothing is done. At a time when everybody else outside Westminster has had to tighten their belts, why should politicians expect to be treated differently, feathering their own nests at taxpayers' expense? The rises in short money are linked to the retail price index inflation every year. But benefits claimants get rises linked to the lower consumer price index inflation each year. So how can any politician look their constituents in the eye and say they deserve a bigger rise every year than someone who's looking for a job or on a pension or living with a disability? The rises in short money are also linked to the number of votes cast at elections. This has contributed this year to an enormous 30% increase, from £7.25 million in 2014-15 to almost £9.5 million this year. How can this be justified when many vital public services are having to cope with cuts of 19%? Short money is also notably untransparent. It is taxpayers' money after all, but there is no requirement to publish details of how it's spent. There are, rightly, requirements on the parallel policy development grants and on pretty much every other area of government funding too. How can it be right, in the modern age, for politicians to expect to be bunged a load of hard-earned taxpayers' cash, more than £35 million in total since 2010 for the Labour Party, for example, without at least explaining how it gets spent? And finally, Mr. Speaker, the distribution of short money between parties throws up some pretty odd results. For example, UKIP, with one MP, gets £688,000, although the honourable gentleman has, in an impressively principled stand, turned some of this down. While the Greens, also with one MP, get less than a third of that. Clearly, it makes sense to ask whether this can be improved. So, Mr. Speaker, these are important questions which need to be answered. The request for views runs until March the 7th, so there is plenty of time for everyone on all sides of the House to submit their views and opinions. And there will also be plenty of time for us to debate these issues here or in Westminster Hall if anyone wants. We're already off to a flying start, Mr. Speaker, with this second UQ, and I will take contributions from everybody here today in the spirit of constructive submissions and suggestions in answer to the questions which the request for views has raised.
Mr. Chris Bryant.
Mr. Speaker, that's all very well, but short money has absolutely nothing to do with the Cabinet Office. It is House business, not government business. The whole point is that it enables Parliament to do its business properly. The accounting officer is not the permanent secretary of the Cabinet Office, it's the clerk of this House. And the Leader of the House should be here doing his job properly and answering questions. Can this Minister confirm that any changes will have to be debated and voted on the floor of this House? Can he confirm that because this is House business, it will not be subject to a government whip? This is the shoddiest consultation, so-called consultation, I've ever come across. It deliberately forgets to mention that short money is linked to how many seats and how many votes all the opposition parties got at a general election. So the main reason that short money has increased in 2015 is because this government has a much smaller majority than the Labour government or the coalition government, and the opposition parties got more seats and more votes than in previous parliaments. Can the Minister confirm that, contrary to what he says, this isn't a 19% cut? With inflation, it's a 24% cut. How can that be right when the Chancellor has increased the cost of his political office to the taxpayer by 204%? Or is there one rule for the opposition and quite another for the government? The Minister said last time that the cost and number of taxpayer-funded Tory special advisers, the only bit of this that he is responsible for, is coming down. But that's not true either, is it? Since the general election, that figure has gone up. So will the government be taking a 19% cut on the 1st of April? No, I don't suppose they will. The consultation, published in the half-term recess, he should be ashamed of himself, allows just 11 working days for responses and then seems to intend to implement a decision less than 3 weeks later. Will that give time for the 2 Conservative-chaired select committees that have expressed an interest in doing inquiries to complete those inquiries? I don't suppose it will. That's another affront to this House. Fair-minded people will conclude that this government is developing a nasty authoritarian streak and that an overweening executive wants to crush all opposition because they're afraid of scrutiny. When we were in government, we trebled short money and the Tories didn't hesitate to bank £46 million. So we won't take any lessons from the Minister. When I was Deputy Leader of the House in 2009, some people suggested we should cut short money for the Conservative Party because other departments in government were facing significant cuts. We said no. Democracy is worth protecting. This isn't a consultation on cutting the cost of politics. We'd welcome that. It's a pernicious ultimatum, and the government should withdraw it unless it's prepared to put SPADs on the table as well. To quote the Minister himself, why should the government be treated any different from the opposition? Feathering their own nest. That's what they're doing.
Minister John Penrose.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to reassure the honourable gentleman that the cost of SPADs, as I mentioned when we last met to discuss this, has fallen since the general election. I would also point out to him that the request for views is entirely clear about the various different causes of the rise in short money, and it also asks for consultation, views and expressions of how it might be amended point by point. So I'm afraid he's quite wrong about the way that the request for views is done. I would also further point out, Mr. Speaker, that even if there are no changes to some of the proposals in the request for views, that the Labour Party will still receive more funding in real terms than the Conservative Party did in 2009-2010, and they will receive an estimated £11 million of taxpayers' money over this Parliament. And there will be no real reduction in cash terms, in fact a small increase in cash terms even after a 90% cut compared to 2014-2015. Mr. Speaker, I was hoping for a more constructive response. I was hoping for a more balanced response. I was hoping for something which I could use as a set of proposals to respond to the request for views. I'm afraid that has not been what we've had, and I deeply regret it. I hope there is still time for us to move forward in a more constructive fashion.
Mr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my honourable friend for launching a consultation which we have to confess seemed to be lacking earlier in this process, and that is obviously a step forward. I think it is legitimate to ask the question whether it costs more or less to run an opposition, depending on how big the majority of the government is. The official opposition is a function that should be carried out regardless of the number of seats that it has. And can I assure my honourable friend that my committee will continue to take an interest in this matter, though I hope that it can be resolved rather more consensually than today's exchanges.
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for those comments and particularly for his final point about trying to resolve these points more consensually. I look forward to any conclusions which his committee arrives at, and I would completely agree with him that it must make sense at least to ask the question and to request views about what the proper cost of running an opposition should be, the official opposition or indeed some of the other opposition parties. They do not necessarily vary depending on the number of votes cast at an election, which the current system does require, for example.
Mr. Patrick Grady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I declare an interest as the National Secretary of the SNP. Now, it's a good thing that a consultation is taking place, but why limit it just to political parties? Why not extend it to the public and other stakeholders who might have an interest? And while there's nothing wrong in principle with reducing the cost of politics, so therefore can we get some assurances on reducing the number and cost of special advisers and indeed of the House of Lords? And given the proximity to the end of the financial year, when will the government be in a position to confirm to the parties and the staff they employ what the settlement is actually going to be?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, obviously the conclusions of the request for views will depend on what views are expressed, so I don't want to prejudge that. We will, however, want to move promptly and swiftly to make sure that any staff who might be affected by any changes that are announced have maximum time for planning, and certainty is around as soon as it can be.
John Glenn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I regard short money as a critical part of our democracy, but given the comparison, the realistic comparison with special advisers and the steps that this government has taken to have transparency around the publication of salaries of senior special advisers, does the Minister not think that it is appropriate for the opposition to have greater transparency around the salaries of their senior appointed researchers?
That's the point.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend who was involved with administering, I think, both short money and policy development grants before he came into this House, knows whereof he speaks. And I think he is absolutely right that it is essential that we demand the same degree of transparency on taxpayers' money for all areas, and that should include not just the cost of SPAs, which is already transparent, but also what money is being spent by both policy development grants and also short money equally.
Mr. Tom Brake.
I have no problem at all with the transparency that has just been asked for. The Minister is a decent man, but I think he's been tasked with doing someone else's dirty business. What he's proposing isn't actually about the cost of politics, because if it was, he'd also be proposing a cut in the budget for special advisers. This is actually about gagging the opposition. Will the Minister scrap this rushed consultation, abandon the attack on the scrutiny of government, and look again at how the cost of politics can be reduced by including, for instance, chopping the budget for special advisers?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman for his kind comments about me, and as a former joint member of the Government Whip's office in the last government, I reciprocate, of course. I would say to him that there are other ways of cutting, he is right, the cost of politics. We have, for example, in front of us proposals to reduce the total number of MPs in this House, as another example. So I wouldn't want to limit what we are planning to do just to this. But we shouldn't let that be the enemy of doing the right thing here either. And therefore, I think it is essential that we proceed with this, and I hope we can rely on his support on this.
Rutari.
Having had a hand in the creation of the policy development grant and also arguing vigorously for short money increases when we were in opposition, I feel that I have to look carefully before arguing for anything other than that this needs to be reconsidered, this decision for such a substantial cut. It does seem to be unacceptable that it's being introduced in 1 year. Everybody understands the need for financial stringency and the need for this House to take its share of those reductions. But could the Minister at least look to whether that reduction can be phased? And could the Minister also pick up carefully the point that's been made about special advisers, which have grown enormously, both under the Labour government bequeathed about 80. I think we got up in the coalition government to about 110. It's been reduced a little bit recently, but still these numbers are very large and do provide a lot of assistance to the government. And I think that there is, although not a symmetry, a relationship between those two numbers, and that to look at short money in isolation would be a mistake.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, can I start by reassuring my honourable friend that we aren't talking about a cut, we're talking about a slower rise, in that the cost of short money has already risen, as I mentioned, by 50% since 2010. So it's a very significant amount of rise already. And we are also talking about reducing the amount of rise which would otherwise, if nothing else was done, continue to be ratcheted up between now and the end of the Parliament. I would also say to him that the cost of SPADs is still, the total salary bill is still lower than the total cost of, you put together government funding from policy development grants, from short money, from other sources. And therefore, I think, while I agree with him that it is not directly comparable, there is some kind of symmetry. I hope he is reassured by the fact that the SPAD salary bill is overall much lower than it is for the total funding of opposition parties.
Mr Nigel Dodds.
Mr. Speaker, can the Minister clarify the situation as regards policy development grants and his thinking on that, and how it ties in with the proposals or views of the Electoral Commission?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the House will be aware that the Independent Electoral Commission has undertaken a fairly careful consultation over some period of time and has made some recommendations. The SI, which I mentioned in my initial remarks, implements some of those, but not all as yet, and we were just holding off on how we proceed with the remainder of the Electoral Commission's recommendations until we have the results of this expression of views, just given the fact that the obvious parallels between short money and policy development grant, we thought it was sensible to make sure that we had one set of answers before we did the others.
Suella Fernandez.
Mr. Speaker, the cost of short money increased by 68% cumulatively since 2010. Is that really justifiable at a time when councils of all colours are making very large efficiency savings? Surely taxpayer-funded political parties can do the same.
Mr. Speaker, I couldn't agree more. I think it's absolutely right that people outside this place, outside the Westminster bubble, will look at our discussions today and they will not understand why politicians feel that they should be treated separately, why they think that politicians should treat themselves as a special case. They will look at what's happened to their budgets over the course of the last 5 or 6 years and say what is sauce for the goose should be sauce for the political gander as well.
Hal Williams.
Mr. Speaker, setting aside for a moment the outrageous detail of the request for views, can the Minister tell the House what effect does he suppose that a cut in short money would have on scrutiny and the comfort or discomfort that the Executive feels as he goes about its business?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned before, the amount of short money has already gone up by 50% since 2010. So opposition parties have a great deal more money with which to do the job than they had before. And I would just referring back to the comment made by the honourable gentleman for UKIP when we last considered this in about 10 days ago, when he's pointed out that the costs of research and many other political functions are now potentially lower. And it is certainly reasonable to expect, given what has been asked of many other government departments and local authorities, for people to work more efficiently in future.
Don Persclave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the public will be astonished that full accounts do not have to be published in this age of transparency. How's the Minister going to put that right?
Well, I devoutly hope, Mr. Speaker, that the result of this will be an increase in transparency. We already have improved transparency on pretty much every other area of taxpayer-funded spending. We already have transparency which is far better than it is for short money on policy development grants, a very similar kind of grant. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, I think it is increasingly out of step with the modern world for us to assume that short money should somehow be magically exempt.
Dr. Alistair MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would challenge the Minister, if I might, Mr. Speaker, because I don't see this money as being for politicians. It's for our staff and for our support teams. And it's essential that we have that staff and support teams so that we deliver and deliver well for our constituents and those people that we serve. Transparency is not an issue. None of us that I'm aware of in this House will dispute transparency, and any moves towards transparency would be broadly supported. But the problem is this. My arithmetic seems to have gone awry here, because my figures tell me that in 2010 the Chancellor employed 4 special advisers at a total cost of $230,000. Today he employs 10 special advisers at a total cost of $700,000. That's a 204% in my arithmetic, and maybe I'm wrong. But how can the Minister defend a 24% cut to those of us that are trying to make things work, and a 204% rise for those in the Chancellor's office. The Chancellor's SPAD team, Mr Speaker, now costs more than the total cost of policy development grant given to all of us here. The DUP, Plaid Cymru, Scottish National Party and the SDLP. The Chancellor gets more than we get.
Minister.
Mr Speaker, as I mentioned before, the cost of special advisers has fallen since the last general election. And I would just point out, Mr Speaker, that Gordon Brown, when he was Chancellor, had more SPADs than the current Chancellor. When he was Chancellor, had more SPADs than the current Chancellor, and that the average salary of a special adviser is currently £2,000 less than it was under Gordon Brown's government in 2009.
Ed Arger.
Thank you, sir. Short money quite rightly exists to enable opposition parties to undertake scrutiny and parliamentary duties. Therefore, many of my constituents will find it hard to understand the funding received by Sinn Féin when their members neither attend this House nor participate in its activities. Will my honourable friend undertake to look at this anomaly?
Well, Mr Speaker, the funding received by Sinn Féin has for a long time been treated as a separate but parallel consideration subject to a separate resolution of this House. And I would expect that to continue and to receive separate special consideration as a result.
Mr Douglas Carswell.
I welcome the government's announcement that it's going to be cutting short money, and can I urge ministers to stick to your guns, don't retreat. The sight of special pleading from political parties wanting to get their hands on taxpayers' cash is disgraceful. Can I urge ministers not only to slash short money, but to insist that all political parties publish fully audited accounts of what they spend that short money on, as my party will be doing at the end of this year, so we can see the hotel bills and what it is they spend that taxpayer money on precisely.
Mr Speaker, I find myself in strong agreement with the honourable gentleman's point. And I would just, it's a time-worn phrase, but it bears repetition. Sunlight is the best disinfectant.
Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm sure the Minister will agree that it's vital the government secures value for money. And given the purpose of the short money is to provide a credible opposition, would he agree that the display we've seen so far today and the announcement of policies like nuclear submarines without nuclear missiles show much of it's been completely squandered?
I hesitate to follow my honourable friend down such a path. But if the purpose of short money is to provide a credible opposition and it has gone up by 50% since 2010, perhaps we now have an incredible opposition instead.
Mr David Winnick.
Since with one exception, which we've just heard, there is such a strong feeling on the opposition benches for what the government is intending to do is to undermine the work of opposition, would it not be sensible to do what was done originally when short money was introduced, namely to have constructive talks with the opposition with no ultimatum in the beginning in order to reach a fair settlement?
Well, Mr Speaker, I had rather hoped that this request for views would elicit a strong and perhaps constructive response. I'm afraid that hasn't been visible so far, but I nonetheless hope that it perhaps may change between now and the end of the period of the request for views. I would also point out to him as well that because we are facing a deficit, time is pressing and we have less fiscal slack to play with.
Mr Andrew Bridgen.
Will these short money reforms mean that the party opposite have to name and give the salaries of their special advisers, in particular those special advisers who write the Leader of the Opposition speeches? Because although I don't know their remuneration, I think they're hugely overpaid.
Minister.
Mr Speaker, given the level of transparency which is already rightly expected of the government when employing, for example, SPADs, I think it is reasonable to ask for an equivalent level of transparency when it comes to how short money is spent on people like, for example, Damien McBride, who I understand has just rejoined the Labour Party's payroll, and indeed people like Seamus Mill as well.
Justin Madders.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Minister talks a lot about savings to the taxpayer, but can he confirm that any savings that will be made by these proposals will in fact be dwarfed by the extra cost to the public purse as a result of the Prime Minister's prolific rate of appointment to the other place?
No, actually, Mr Speaker, the cost of the House of Lords, I'm told, is falling, even while its numbers are rising. And so, therefore, the cost of the public purse will be reduced as a result of the changes that are happening at the other end. However, on his broader point about whether or not this amount of money is worthwhile, at the risk of angering my colleagues from Scotland, many a mickle makes a muckle. It matters what we save, and it matters that we pay attention to every single detail, given the scale of the deficit which we have inherited from the last Labour government.
Mark Spencer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I hope the Minister would recognise there appears to be consensus in the House around transparency. So would it be fair enough to, given that the government has reduced its travel costs within its time in government, that the opposition should actually publicise its travel costs and claims for special advisers running up and down the country?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, an intriguing proposal. I will take it as a constructive suggestion for the request for views, and I thank him very much for it.
Julie Elliott.
Speaker, given the increase in costs since 2009 of SPADs by some 56%, the proposed cut in the short money of 24% over 4 years is disgraceful. Isn't the Minister ashamed of his government's attack on democracy and scrutiny in this House?
Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I think we've already covered these points. The level of short money has gone up by 50% already. It's gone up by 30% in the last year. I think people listening to these exchanges will be asking themselves, how much does it cost to run an opposition, and why do politicians feel that they are so much more deserving of cash than, for example, benefits claimants whose money has not risen anything like the same speed?
Dr Matthew Offord.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Given the public's perception about the performance of the Leader of the Opposition, perhaps we should just take the opposition money away completely.
Mr Speaker, I will take that as a suggestion and a proposal. I suspect probably that the weight of views across the House may be rather against that, and that people do feel there is a place for short money if it is properly reformed, in the same way as there is a place for policy development grant, in order to make sure that an effective opposition, properly funded, not excessively funded, can function.
Margaret Ritchie.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Again, I'll ask the question. With the cost of government SPADs rising, would the Minister concede that a disgraceful 24% cut to opposition parties' scrutiny funds is a case of double standards and an impediment to the scrutiny by the opposition parties of the executive?
Mr Speaker, I'm afraid I would respectfully disagree with the honourable lady, if only because the cost of SPADs, as I mentioned before, has fallen since the general election, and the cost of SPADs will still remain lower than the total funding for opposition parties.
Mr Christopher Pincher.
Mr Speaker, spending short money is unnecessarily opaque. So in his consultation, will my honourable friend seek representation from senior and numerate members of the opposition, such as the member for Hull West and Hessel, Nottingham East and Islwyn, as to whether they think that the taxpayer, and indeed their own party, gets value for money from the likes of Seamus Mill?
Well, Mr Speaker, I will take submissions from any member of this House on any side of this House as to what would be what would involve good value for money. But I think he's absolutely right to focus on this question: what is value for money? How much does it cost to run an opposition office? And can we make sure that it is done as efficiently as possible with taxpayers' cash?
Mrs Helen Goodman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The fact is that the number of special advisers has gone up to 96. The Prime Minister has appointed a record 236 peers to the other place. Meanwhile, the government has introduced the Lobbying Act, is attempting to gag the trade unions and is cutting the short money. This shows that the government is not interested in cutting the cost of politics. It's absolutely clear they want to silence any opposition in this country.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm afraid I don't accept the premise of the honourable lady's question at all. I mean, we are at the same time proposing to cut the number of MPs in this place, so we are very serious. It's not an easy thing to do. very serious about cutting the costs of politics. And I therefore hope that people will, in that spirit, contribute to this request for views in a constructive fashion.
Mr. Paul Maynard.
Does the Minister agree with me that my constituents at least have the right to see as much transparency as possible in how short money is being spent? Because for all they know, it could be being used by honourable members to help them write their books.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that the opposition, any of the opposition parties, would not spend money, taxpayers' money, in such a disrespectful fashion. But of course, they will have nothing to hide, and therefore I'm sure that nobody will be at all concerned about proposals for increased transparency.
Paula Sheriff.
Mr. Speaker, can the Minister confirm this will have to be done by a resolution of the whole House? And if so, does he have a date in mind for such a resolution?
Mr. Speaker, the parliamentary process is as usual on these things, so there will have to be a proposal which has, for the SI, which has already been laid for policy development grants, that can be either passed or prayed against in the normal way. And when we come up with proposals for short money, it has to be passed by a resolution of this House. She's absolutely right.
Jake Berry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Minister confirm that during the consultation he will specifically look at protecting and supporting the interests of minority parties? They have a hugely important role to play in this Parliament, especially when we have such a divided and weak official opposition.
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I gave in my initial remarks an illustration of some of the peculiarities in the distribution of short money. And I illustrated it by comparisons between the money received by UKIP and the Greens, but there are other examples, and many members on the smaller opposition parties will be able to quote me examples about why they feel they're either being remunerated or over-remunerated, depending on who they are. And therefore I think it is certainly sensible for us to ask the question about how that can be improved and whether or not the basis of allocation can be made better.
Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you. Cutting the cost of politics, the Minister says. Cutting the number of elected MPs while stuffing the other place full of his mates. Cutting support to opposition parties whilst greatly increasing the number of special advisers in government. If he wants to cut the cost of politics, can he tell this House why the Conservative Party has claimed £1.27 million since 2010 in policy development grant?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the allocations of money as per policy development grants are based on recommendations from the Independent Electoral Commission, not by proposals from the government. And I would also point out to him that we are practising what we preach, because in previous years the allocation of policy development grants to the Conservative Party has been scaled back. We have handed some of that money back for precisely the reasons that I described earlier about wanting to cut the cost of politics.
Robert Jenrick.
Mr. Speaker, with a national debt of £1.5 trillion, or £24,000 for every man, woman and child in this country, and some government departments making heroic efforts to cut back-office functions, like the Ministry of Justice that is cutting 50% of its back-office functions, what possible signal does it send out to the country and the civil servants doing those jobs to see some political parties refusing even to engage with sensible reforms of their own funding?
Mr. Speaker, I couldn't agree more. The general public will not understand why politicians feel that we should be a special case. They will look at this and listen to this debate and say, why should these guys think that they are in any way deserving of better treatment than people who are on benefits and struggling with the budget? Why should they get a special deal?
Diana Johnson.
And I don't think the general public will understand why in the Cabinet Office there are 50 press and communication officers. In the Ministry of Justice there are 42 external communication officers. So shouldn't the government start to cut its own, tighten its own belt and cut its own cloth first?
Mr. Speaker, the government is putting its own house in order. We have made dramatic savings in the public sector over the course of the last Parliament, and we are continuing to make further savings across the whole of government, 19% for unprotected departments in this Parliament too. So I would respectfully refute the honourable lady's starting assumption.
Can I begin?
Mr. Speaker, in the last Parliament, I was an advisor to the then Shadow Secretary of State for Defence, the Honourable Member for Gedling, along with one other part-time member of staff. In contrast, the government ministers had 4 special advisors, a series of private offices, and hundreds of press officers and policy advisors. There is no equivalence. Will he accept that short money is not profligate? It is the minimum required for opposition in a healthy parliamentary democracy.
Well, Mr. Speaker, if it is the minimum required for sensible opposition, then perhaps the honourable gentleman can answer why it is so much higher now than it was 5 years ago in real terms, and why it is so much higher or would be even still higher than it was in 2014-15. If the costs of running an opposition are consistent, and they may even be potentially lower than they used to be, then actually the current levels of short money, having risen so far, must be an over budget and something which can be saved.
Order.